Julia Reynolds sat at her desk, eyes glued to the computer screen, though the words blurred into a sea of incomprehensible text. The once aspiring young woman now found herself locked in an invisible cage, her every breath stifled by the oppressive atmosphere of her workplace. The office, a dull maze of grey cubicles and dim lighting, had once been a place of promise for her, a stepping stone to the career she had always dreamed of. But now, it was nothing more than a battlefield, and she was losing. Her boss, Daniel Harper, had been the first to congratulate her when she was hired at Rickson Financial, a prestigious firm in downtown Chicago. "You're going to do great things here, Julia," he had said, his voice warm and encouraging. At the time, she had smiled brightly, eager to prove herself in the fast-paced world of finance. Fresh out of college, with a degree in business administration, she had ambitions of climbing the corporate ladder, of making a name for herself in a male-dominated industry. But those dreams had quickly been tainted by Daniel's growing interest in her, a sickening interest that had nothing to do with her abilities or her potential. It had started innocuously enough, a hand on her shoulder that lingered a little too long, a compliment on her appearance that seemed too personal. She had brushed it off at first, convincing herself that she was overreacting, that he was just being friendly. But the friendly gestures soon turned into something far more sinister. Julia remembered the first time Daniel had crossed the line, how his fingers had grazed her thigh during a meeting, the way his eyes had darkened when she stiffened in response. "Relax, Julia," he had whispered afterward, his breath hot against her ear. "You're too tense. We're all friends here." She had forced a smile, her heart pounding in her chest, and tried to pull away, but he only tightened his grip, his fingers digging into her flesh like claws. The encounter had left her shaken, but she had said nothing. Who would believe her? Daniel was well-respected, charming, the kind of man who knew how to play the game. The harassment escalated over the following weeks. Daniel became bolder, cornering her in the break room when no one was around, sending her suggestive texts late at night, his tone becoming more demanding, more possessive. He would remind her of how lucky she was to have the job, how easily it could all be taken away. And with each new advance, Julia's confidence eroded further, like sand slipping through her fingers. She tried to fight back in her own way, avoiding him as much as possible, dressing more conservatively, hoping it would make her less noticeable. But nothing worked. His advances became a shadow that followed her everywhere, a constant reminder of her helplessness. The weight of it all began to crush her spirit, and the vibrant, ambitious woman she once was started to disappear, replaced by someone she barely recognized, a woman haunted by fear and self-doubt. Her work began to suffer, and the vibrant spark that once defined her dimmed to a flicker. She would sit at her desk, paralyzed, staring at her screen for hours, unable to focus. The financial reports she used to complete with ease now took her twice as long, the numbers blurring together as her thoughts spiraled into a vortex of despair. Her co-workers noticed the change, but when they asked if she was all right, she simply nodded, forcing a smile she didn't feel. How could she explain what was happening? How could she make them understand? One evening, as the office began to empty, Daniel called her into his office. She hesitated at the door, her stomach twisting in knots. She knew what he wanted. He had been hinting at it for weeks, his intentions clear in the way he looked at her, the way he spoke to her. "Close the door, Julia," he said, his voice dripping with authority. She did as she was told, her hands trembling as she took a seat opposite him. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes roaming over her body with a predatory gleam. "You've been distracted lately," he remarked, his tone casual, as if discussing the weather. "Is something on your mind?" Julia swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "I've just been tired," she lied, trying to keep her voice steady. Daniel's lips curled into a knowing smile. "You should learn to relax," he said, his voice softening as he leaned forward. "There are ways to relieve stress, you know." His hand slid across the desk, reaching for hers. Julia pulled her hand back as if she had been burned. "Please, Daniel," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I just want to do my job." His smile vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating stare. "I'm trying to help you, Julia," he said, his voice taking on a menacing edge. "But if you don't want my help—" He let the sentence hang in the air, the unspoken threat loud and clear. The walls of his office seemed to close in on her, the air thick with tension. Julia felt a wave of nausea wash over her as she realized how trapped she was. There was no escape from this man, no way to stop what was happening. And the worst part was that she had no one to turn to. She had confided in a colleague once, a woman she had considered a friend, only to be met with disbelief. "Daniel? No, you must be mistaken," the woman had said, shaking her head. "He's always been so professional, so kind. You must have misunderstood his intentions." The conversation had left Julia feeling more isolated than ever, her last shred of hope extinguished. As the weeks dragged on, Julia's torment continued. The once promising job she had worked so hard to attain had become a waking nightmare. She was plagued by sleepless nights, haunted by the memories of Daniel's unwanted advances, his touch lingering on her skin like a stain she couldn't wash away. Her self-worth crumbled, each day a reminder of how powerless she was in a world that refused to see her pain. In desperation, Julia decided to speak to the HR department, praying that someone there would listen, that they would take her seriously. She walked into the HR office one afternoon, her heart pounding in her chest, and asked to speak with the manager. The woman who greeted her was cool and composed, her expression unreadable as Julia poured out her story, her voice trembling with emotion. She recounted everything, the inappropriate comments, the touching, the threats, hoping that this woman, at least, would understand. But the HR manager's response was far from what Julia had hoped for. "Are you sure you're not overreacting?" she asked, her tone patronizing. "Daniel is a respected member of this company. It's hard to believe he would do something like that." Julia felt a wave of disbelief wash over her. How could this woman dismiss her so easily after everything she had just shared? "I'm not making this up," she insisted, her voice rising in desperation. "Please, you have to believe me." The manager sighed, tapping her pen against the desk. "I understand that you're upset, Julia," she said, her voice now laced with condescension. "But without concrete evidence, there's not much we can do. You need to be careful about making such serious accusations." Julia left the HR office feeling more defeated than ever. She had done everything she was supposed to do, followed all the steps she had been told to take, and still, no one would help her. The world she had once viewed as full of possibilities had become a prison, the bars forged from indifference and disbelief. Her thoughts grew darker with each passing day, her mind a whirlpool of despair and hopelessness. She began to withdraw from her friends and family, too ashamed to tell them what was happening, too afraid of their reactions. She couldn't bear the thought of seeing the doubt in their eyes, of hearing them say that she was imagining things, that she was overreacting. But one night, as she sat alone in her small apartment, the weight of it all became too much to bear. The walls seemed to close in around her, the silence deafening. She thought about everything she had endured, about how powerless she felt, about how no one had believed her. And in that moment, something inside her snapped. Julia made a decision that would change everything. She was done being a victim, done being the helpless girl who was too afraid to stand up for herself. If no one else would help her, she would have to take matters into her own hands. She spent the next few days carefully planning her next move, her mind consumed by thoughts of revenge and justice. She knew she couldn't go on living like this, with Daniel's shadow looming over her, his touch still lingering on her skin. She had to do something to free herself, to take back the control that he had stolen from her. The plan was simple but effective. Julia knew that Daniel often stayed late at the office, working long hours after everyone else had gone home. She would wait until the office was empty, then confront him, once and for all. She rehearsed what she would say, how she would make him pay for everything he had done to her. The thought of seeing the fear in his eyes, of finally making him understand what he had put her through, filled her with a dark sense of satisfaction. The night finally came. Julia waited until the office was nearly empty, her heart pounding in her chest as she watched the clock. She waited until she was sure that only Daniel remained, then made her way to his office, her footsteps silent on the carpeted floor. She found him sitting at his desk, completely absorbed in his work, unaware of her presence. For a moment she just stood there, watching him, her hands trembling. She felt a surge of anger, a burning rage that threatened to consume her. How dare he sit there, so calm and composed, as if nothing had happened? How dare he act as if he hadn't destroyed her life? "Daniel," she said, her voice cold and steady. He looked up, surprised to see her standing in the doorway. "Julia," he said, leaning back in his chair, a smile playing at the corners of his lips. "What can I do for you?" Her eyes narrowed as she stepped into the office, closing the door behind her. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice firm. He raised an eyebrow, still smiling. "About what?" Julia took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. "About what you've been doing to me," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "About the harassment." His smile faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "Julia," he said, his tone condescending, "I think you're mistaken. I've done nothing but try to help you." "Help me?" she spat, her anger boiling over. "You've been tormenting me, Daniel. You've made my life a living hell, and I'm done letting you get away with it." His expression darkened, his eyes narrowing. "Watch your tone, Julia," he said, his voice low and threatening. "You're treading on dangerous ground." But Julia wasn't afraid anymore. She had reached her breaking point and there was no going back. "No, Daniel," she said, her voice rising. "You're the one who needs to watch out. You think you're untouchable, but you're not. I'm going to make sure everyone knows what you've done." He stood up, towering over her, his eyes filled with fury. "You think anyone will believe you?" he snarled. "I'm respected, Julia. I'm admired. You're nothing but a little girl who doesn't know her place." The words cut through her like a knife, but they only fueled her determination. "We'll see about that," she said, her voice cold as ice. In a blur of movement, Daniel lunged at her, his hands wrapping around her throat. Julia gasped, struggling to breathe as his grip tightened. Panic surged through her, her mind racing as she fought to free herself, but he was too strong. The room spun around her, her vision darkening as she felt her strength fading. But just as she thought it was over, something inside her snapped. With a surge of adrenaline, she reached for the letter opener on his desk, her fingers closing around the cool metal handle. In one swift motion, she plunged it into his side, the blade sinking deep into his flesh. Daniel let out a strangled cry, his grip on her throat loosening as he stumbled back, clutching his side. Julia gasped for air, her lungs burning as she staggered back, her hands trembling. She watched in shock as Daniel collapsed to the floor, blood pooling around him, his eyes wide with fear. For a moment, Julia just stood there, frozen in place, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. She had done it. She had finally stopped him. But as she looked down at his lifeless body, the reality of what she had done began to sink in. She had killed him. The weight of her actions crashed down on her like a tidal wave, her legs giving out as she sank to the floor, her body shaking with sobs. She had wanted to be free, to take back control of her life, but now all she felt was a crushing sense of guilt and despair. The police arrived within minutes, alerted by a security guard who had heard the commotion. They found Julia sitting on the floor of Daniel's office, her hands stained with his blood, her eyes empty and hollow. She didn't resist as they placed her in handcuffs, didn't say a word as they led her out of the building. She felt nothing. In the weeks that followed, the media had a field day with the story, painting Julia as a troubled young woman who had snapped under the pressure of her job. The details of the harassment were glossed over, overshadowed by the sensationalism of the crime. No one cared about what had driven her to that point. No one cared about the hell she had endured. She was just another headline, another tragic story to be forgotten in time. Julia was sentenced to prison, her life forever changed by the events of that night. But as she sat in her cell, staring out at the bleak, grey walls, she couldn't help but feel a strange sense of relief. For the first time in months, she was free from Daniel's grip, free from the fear that had haunted her every waking moment. But the price of that freedom was higher than she could have ever imagined. In the end, Julia's story was a somber reminder of the devastating consequences of silence, of the pain that so many women endure in the shadows, their voices unheard, their stories dismissed. And as she sat in her cell, the weight of her actions pressing down on her, she knew that her life would never be the same. She had won her freedom, but it had come at a cost she would bear for the rest of her days.